Welcome, everyone. All right, so we are continuing. We are in chapter 2, part 3, the rightness of reason. And the plan is that in today's class, we're going to conclude this chapter. Yes, we are in the theory and practice of universal ethics, the Noahide laws, by Rabbi Dr. Shimon Dovid Cowen, page 48. And we would like to, as I said, go through page 55, which is the last part of chapter 2. And this is somewhat philosophical, as we've been doing the past number of classes. All right. So, without any real introduction, just as we get to each piece, can discuss it a little bit. Page 48, right in the middle, 3, the rightness of reason. Weber and Aristotle, rationality and natural success. All right, we're all familiar to one degree or another with Aristotle for sure, arguably the most famous philosopher, and Maimonides, which we're going to discuss a lot in this section. The Rambam, Maimonides, actually quotes Aristotle and disagrees with him oftentimes. The Rambam, so I'm going to give a very brief introduction. Maimonides, the Rambam, he wrote many books, letters, commentary, tremendous amount. He is arguably the greatest that a human being can be. And if you had to have one handful of the greatest people ever, according to many, he's right up there. On his tombstone, it says in Hebrew, from Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses. Meaning from the original Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, the one who led the Jewish people out of bondage, out of Egypt, and that God Almighty gave us the Torah through him, through Moses. And Maimonides, the Rambam, who's called Rabbi Moses, son of Maimon, so I guess in Greek, son of Maimon would be Maimonides. That's why he's known as Maimonides. There was nobody else as great as them. If you think about that, that's a very extreme statement, because in between them, you had all the prophets and all of the great Jewish sages of the oral tradition, of the Mishnah and the Talmud, because Maimonides was after all that. At any rate, all of the writings of Maimonides were in the spoken language at the time for himself and the countries he was living in, and for the Jews that he was dealing with, and that is Arabic, with the exception of his greatest accomplishment, of his magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah, his code of law, where he covers the laws of all 613 commandments, and it's divided into 14 books. That he wrote in Lashon HaKodesh, in Hebrew. Now, one of the things that he wrote, one of the books he wrote, is called the Moire Nevuchim, and they usually translate it as the Guide to the Perplexed, which that is Jewish philosophy. That really is the Rambam's philosophy, although you'll find his philosophy on life and so forth in other places as well, as we're about to quote over here, different sources. But the Moire Nevuchim is really where he quotes Aristotle and others, and that's where he explains completely rationally Judaism and belief in God and the performance of the commandments of the mitzvahs. Because a lot of people were perplexed, were confused and they needed his guidance. Okay. Now, another thing, in his commentary to the Mishnah, to the Talmud, the oral law, so he wrote a commentary on all of the entire Mishnah. But when it came to the tractate of Avos, known as Ethics of the Fathers, which is different than all the other tractates of the Talmud, this one is pretty much ethics, not laws pertaining to a particular commandment, but in a sense, it precedes all the commandments, and it's basically telling the individual how they need to behave without getting into details of particular laws and the do's and the don'ts, but in general. Now, as an introduction to that commentary on that tractate, the Rambam wrote 8 chapters, and that became known as the Shemona Prakim, the 8 chapters. So within rabbinic literature, when you speak of Maimonides' 8 chapters, everybody knows that you're talking about those 8 chapters, which are the introduction to Avos. Okay, so we are going to bring in and discuss things from Maimonides. Weber's ethic of responsibility sought to modify prior value commitments through calculation of their consequences. In so doing, its purpose was also to make actions realistic and assured of some degree of success value. It is attuned to what Weber calls the autonomous logic of the world, as distinct from the irrationality of consequences embarked upon through a pure ethic of conviction. The significance of success as a criterion for ethics is elaborated in Aristotle's thought. Central to his ethics is the famous doctrine of the mean as a rule and criterion for ethical conduct, associated in the Nicomachean ethics with the notion of success. Success has frequently a material, natural sense, similar to the promotion of physical health. P. Hubie draws attention to an analogy in Aristotle between the wise ethics and the physician. So he does make the comparison between ethics, which would be not emotional, but would be a person's proper moral philosophy, conduct, and a physician, which is, as we said, physical health. Aristotle's approach is, and this is the way that Hubie explains it, to draw a distinction between the good man and the bad man, which he takes to be similar to the distinction between a healthy man and a sick one. The healthy man has a taste for food that is truly wholesome, while the sick man may fancy other things. In the same way, the good man wishes for what is truly good, but the bad man has a variety of wishes, and in particular is led astray by pleasure. Okay, so basically, to understand the philosophy and the disposition of the individual emotionally, so we're going to take something which is very concrete, and that is physical health. So you have a person who's healthy and only eats healthy and exercises in a healthy way and has a healthy lifestyle and is not interested in things which are unhealthy. Whereas the unhealthy person is led by what is pleasurable, what tastes good, what feels good, even though it's not good. It's actually unhealthy for the person. So the same way, without getting into the physical health, such as eating and exercising and so forth, but in general, in the person's conduct and behavior. Now, Marvin Fox was a Jewish man who actually studied here in Chicago, in university, as well as in the HTC Hebrew Theological College. And as you see in footnote 39, that no, sorry, 42, that his book was published by the University of Chicago Press in 1990. So Marvin Fox also describes Aristotle's doctrine of the mean as a highly naturalistic one. The mean is good in that it accords with the principle that nature always seeks the middle way. Now remember that. Okay? It copies, in Weber's words, the purported autonomous logic of the world. In other words, in everything, basically, you have the two extremes, and then you have the middle path, the exact middle of both extremes. So nature always seeks the middle way, and to go to either extreme is unnatural, abnormal, unnatural. Now, if you go to the good extreme, that may be good, but that's not natural, as we're going to discuss. Nicholas Rescher spells out this model of natural rationality in the realm of ethics, most bluntly. He introduces a rationality of ends based on real and legitimate interests. And now we quote him. If our ends, meaning our goals and values, are themselves inappropriate, if they run counter to our real and legitimate interests, then no matter how sagaciously, which means intellectually and good, we cultivate them, we're not being fully rational. A voyage to a foolish destination, no matter how efficiently conducted, is a foolish enterprise. Okay? In other words, we're talking about the means and the end. If your end, if your goal is wrong, is off, is bad, then the means to there is by definition off, even though it may be a lot of good stuff and a lot of good things. But since it's the journey to get to that point, and that point is off, then the whole thing is off. Rescher similarly puts it that values that impede the realization of a person's best interest are clearly inappropriate. Okay, it's that simple. But what are these best interests of a human being? Right? Who's going to decide, who's going to define what's in the person's best interest? Do they include a reliance upon prayer or a foregoing of material advantage in order to fulfill precepts which are not comprehended by natural scientific reasoning? In other words, we're getting over here into religion, and we say that God commanded us to do certain things which rationally make no sense, as we've discussed in a previous class. Those are referred to in the Torah language as chukim. Those are laws or statutes which are beyond rational, they're irrational. So is that considered the person's best interest? So Aristotle's key word in relation to correct ethical conduct is the flourishing of a human being. But what does to flourish mean? Rescher explains it along the lines of his earlier quoted notion of a real and legitimate interests. as objective needs. The rationality of ends inheres in the simple fact that we humans have various needs, that we require not only nourishment and protection for the maintenance of health, but also information, cognitive orientation, affection, freedom of action, and much else besides. So there's more to it than just physically being healthy or even mentally being healthy. There's more to it. Without such varied goods, we cannot flourish as human beings. We cannot achieve the condition of human well-being that Aristotle called flourishing. The person who does not give these manifold desertata their due, who may even set out to frustrate their realization, is clearly not being rational. So if you understand that you need to be this wholesome person all around and accomplish certain things and contribute to society and so forth, so therefore, if a person does anything which negates that, then you're not, in this Aristotle language, flourishing. In short, this ethic is a biological one. The ethics is a doctor who recommends those values and preferences which best assure the human being's negotiation of nature as a natural being. Nature is the sole autonomous reality, and success and well-being flows from obeying its laws. So it's from within nature. So what we're sort of saying now is, if I understand it correctly, don't view it that there is this world, this natural world, which science studies and explains and explores. And then you have these God-given laws which may contradict with the world, and then you have to make a choice and say, well, I'm not going to go along with the natural world or with my natural inclination, but I'm going to suppress everything. I'm going to go against everything, and I'm going to do what God says. No, that's not the way it is. The God-given laws, since he's the creator, is the most natural thing. Just we need these laws given by the divine in order for us to cooperate in a healthy way and to know what is natural. Because if we go after our own feelings or even after our own intellectual, rational mind, who knows where we would end up. So it is a built-in part of nature, because the creator is the commander of these commandments, and it's not like he's wearing two different hats. Well, here I created this kind of world, and here I'm giving you these commandments of all the don'ts that or do's and don'ts of how to conduct yourself in the world. No. The only way to properly live in this world that I created for a purpose is by following these rules. The Noahide laws and the spiritual orientation of reason. If secular rationality is anchored within an imminent natural concept of human success or flourishing, the Noahide laws and Noahide theology start from the opposite point of view. Nature is not autonomous. It is enlivened from a spiritual source. In its descent from that spiritual source, it is capable of corruption, along with the corruption of human intellect itself, a created entity within creation. In other words, it doesn't start with creation, with nature. And the highest form is not intellect. What is of normative significance is not the successful negotiation with all the hidden value criteria in that success of nature and society, but rather the spiritual template of divinely given values, So you have to start with that point. It's very important. It is these which not only possess normative authority, but also bring the true long-term success, even in natural terms. It's just, we don't see the whole picture. And there's a process here, and there's a goal over here. But ultimately, from the world's perspective, for the natural world to play itself up properly and to live a healthy and proper and productive, or Aristotle, flourishing life, you need to follow these divine rules. Rationality, which wants effectuous normality, needs to remain attuned to the spiritual source, which defines and specifies the values through which the human is meant to affect the desired normality of nature and society. This point is brought out in the comparison of Aristotle's doctrine of the mean with an ostensibly similar teaching in Maimonides. So now we're going to bring in Maimonides, which he seems to be saying the same thing as Aristotle. The latter is found both in Maimonides' introduction, known as the 8 chapters to the Mishnaic work, Ethics of the Fathers, as well as in the section, The Laws of Personal Development, of his great halachic code, the Mishnah Torah, which I mentioned both of those. So in 2 places, Maimonides makes the following point. Here, Maimonides appears to be saying something quite similar to Aristotle, namely, that one should seek virtues which take up a middle position between extremes. He actually makes that point very clear, Maimonides. In some places, Maimonides applies this rule quite straightforwardly. Thus, liberty or generosity is the mean between the extremes of miserliness and squandering. 2 extremes, 2 opposites. Yet, as Marvin Fox observes, Maimonides regularly invokes the rule of the mean, but just as regularly deviates from it. That's his observation. Thus, between arrogance and humility, one should not seek a mean, but wholly embrace humility. But the truth is that's an exception. Maimonides himself says that is an exception, that don't follow the middle road in that case. Now, in truth, Aristotle also says that there are some behaviors which are wholly and unqualified bad, such as immoral relationships which allow of no moderation. The real difference, however, between the thinkers is, as Fox writes, that Maimonides is not invoking a natural principle, but rather the imitation of the divine. Physicians of the soul must be trained by divine norms. They are not training man on the analogy of training a dog or a horse. Rather, they are directing a human soul in its totality towards the divine ideal. Still, the question remains, why does Maimonides use the term the mean when he is in fact referring to a divine norm? The term mean seems to imply a wholly natural concept, a midpoint between extremes. Okay, so this is understood first by reference to the idea that the mean in Maimonides is associated with the idea of reciprocity and harmony. The mean balances the extremes, not simply in the sense of midpointing them, but because the extremes are potentially able to agree to the mean. It represents the notion of peace or compromise between the extremes. In the words of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a quality of character is called median because it gives place to another. Maimonides states in the 8 chapters that in the verse, love, truth, and peace. Peace refers to the ethical virtues, for they will lead to peace in the world. Peace is the rational order of conduct in creation, which practice of the divine law brings about. It is here called the mean. In short, the mean refers to the central notion of rationality, that of peace. which is sense of balance and harmony. So peace or harmony, by definition, is neither extreme. That's the whole point. It's able to harmoniously blend the two together, and there is a proper balance. Maimonides, moreover, states that the halachic requirement to pursue conduct, which expresses the mean, is associated with the verse, and you shall go in his paths. And he actually says that that's a commandment. Okay, the verse in the Torah says that you are to go in the paths of God. The Lubavitcher Rebbe here asks a question. God's paths are his commandments. Why then does Maimonides enumerate beyond the totality of specific commandments a general commandment to observe the commandments contained in the verse, and you shall go in his paths? Every commandment is his path. So why does Maimonides make it a separate requirement go in his paths? His paths, there are 613 of them for the Jew. So what's the meaning here? The answer to this question proceeds from the knowledge that the commandments are individually intended to instill specific qualities in the human who performs them. As found in the statement of the sages, just as the Holy One, blessed be He, is called gracious, so should you be gracious. Just as the Holy One, blessed be He, is called merciful, so you should be merciful, and so on. The Lubavitcher Rebbe explains that in order fully to actualize the qualities which individual commandments are intended to implant in the agent, although some result is achieved even without this intention, it depends on the commandment, but most of them, even if you don't have intention, but you just did the deed, the main thing is the action. But in addition to that, what you really need, though, there must be a going in them. As the verse says, you shall go in his paths. In other words, to be a mover, a traveler, as opposed to angels are called oimdim. They're stationary. They're very, very high level of godliness, but it's stationary. Whereas the soul is called a mahalach, a goer. So that's the key. And that's what the verse says, go in his paths. This refers to a spiritual ascent, accompanying the practical performance of the precept. Besides doing the dry act, keeping the law, and doing the commandment as prescribed in action, there has to be also this feeling accomplished through the attitude of faith or belief by which one seeks to imitate God. Okay, since he is merciful, I need to be merciful. So I'm trying to imitate him. Since he is gracious, I need to be gracious. Since he is kind, I need to be kind. So it's not just, well, do the act. He said, give charity. I gave charity. What's the difference? What I think and what I believe and what I feel. No, because you're missing a very important part. And that, Maimonides, is deriving from the verse that says, go in his paths. It is a spiritual service and aspiration to imitate God, which achieves the right tuning of action that expresses and installs peace in the world. Spirituality attunes rationality. So that's how we get peace, not just by simply doing the act of charity, etc., but it's by being a goer, by having this belief. This concept is elaborated in the 6th chapter of the 8 chapters, where Maimonides cites the words of the sages that one should not say with regard to the precepts which are not rationally grasped, such as a Jew in relation to the Jewish dietary laws, meaning kosher, and laws concerning ritual impurity, tuma and tahara, purity and impurity. So one should not say that one would find impossible, meaning repugnant, the transgression of these laws. No, that's not what you're supposed to say. Not supposed to say, I would never want to go against these laws. Me, eat non-kosher? Disgusting. Rather, one should say, it is possible for me, but what shall I do? My Father in heaven decreed against it. So the attitude of the Jew is supposed to be, I really wish I could eat not kosher, but what could I do? Out of my hands. Not to say, it's disgusting, I don't want it. The reason for this is ostensibly the rationality should not seek to encroach upon a plainly super-rational realm. So you have to clearly understand this is super rational. This is beyond understanding. And I'm just doing it because it is the divine will. However, Maimonides goes on to say that one may not say this regarding those commandments which are rationally grasped, such as not killing or stealing, and the Noahide laws in general, because they're all rational laws. So then you don't have that attitude. They should be repugnant to reason. And you should say, steal? I would never steal, even if God didn't command. And so forth. For, as the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains, one whose reason does not find them repugnant, if you intellectually don't see that they're disgusting and they're wrong to transgress, the ones that are rational, has experienced a basic corruption in the qualities of personality. So something seriously wrong with your with your personality. And even though you're not going to transgress and you're going to keep all the laws and you're not going to do what God says not to do, but if it's coming from a place of, like we described before, your attitude should be for the irrational ones, then there's a problem. Rationality without spiritual tuning, without the qualities acquired in the imitation of God, is itself corrupt. So, on the one hand, bottom line, we do say, it says, as a matter of fact, in the Ethics of the Father, that the main thing is deed. Bottom line, the main thing is your behavior. Keep the laws. Do what God says to do, and make sure to refrain from what he says not to do. That's it. That's the main thing. Very, very, very correct. However, what's extremely important, and especially as we're talking to Noachites and their laws, because all the Noachite laws are rational, it's extremely important that the person is doing it with faith, with belief, and that they're in that position, that they want to imitate God, and therefore there's right and there's wrong, and who's to say what's right and who's to say what's wrong? God says what's right and what's wrong, but then I am fine-tuned enough, I am sensitive enough that that's my natural feeling. And the details I may have to look up in the book, the details I may have to ask, fine. But in general, don't kill. Who said? What do you mean? It doesn't make sense to kill. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't worship any other deity. Blasphemy. All those things are laws which make perfect sense. So that's pretty much what we're saying over here in this chapter. Okay, so that's for today. And then we have, for next time, we are currently up to chapter 3, which would be on page 57. And now we open up for questions or comments, please. Anyone? Yes, go ahead. Who raised his hand?
James.
James, please.
Hi, Rabbi Turin. Thank you. It's a little off topic, but I was just reading this in the Tanya, and I believe you touched on it. If you could expound upon it or maybe cite a verse. I was actually looking for a verse. But in, what's this called? Hinoch Cotton, the beginning of Lucate Amarim, he's talking about, he's in the English, it says especially so, for a man is called mobile and not static. And in the Hebrew, it says Nikra Mahalech Velo Omed. Is that kind of what you were referring to?
Exactly.
Okay, that's like Hashkacha Pratis for me. Baby basically gave me a little bit of chills. So could you expound on that or tell me like where that comes from or anything that could elucidate my understanding?
Yes, everybody can benefit from this. Let me just explain a little bit your question. We mentioned about being a goer, that it's important that we're into it, that we want to do naturally these commandments. Okay, so I said that angels are stationary. They're very, very high levels of godliness, but they're not moving anywhere, whereas souls are going. Okay, so it's based on a verse, which let me find it. The verse the words in Hebrew are "V'nosati lecha mahalchin ben ha'indim ha'eleh," that God says, "I will give you moving, traveling, going amongst these that are standing stationary." Let me see if I can find where that's quoted, where it is. Okay, it is Zechariah, chapter 3, verse 7. And it's actually the Haftarah for one of the weeks on Shabbos. Now, the way that it's explained by the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, in two of his main works, Torah Or and Likutei Torah, is that angels, and so too souls prior to their descent into this physical world, into the body, are called standing. And it is specifically the souls that come down into this physical world, that get God's commandments, that's when they become mehalchim, goers, movers, because it is specifically through the commandments that the individual then becomes a goer. Now, he explains further, again, the Alter Rebbe says that even prior to the descent into this world, souls are constantly going higher and higher. So why are we calling them standing stationary? He says because their elevations from level to level is all in a progression of within a framework of relative. Each level is one notch higher than the previous one. It's in an orderly fashion, and therefore they don't skip or jump in a massive way. And that's why in the big scheme, they're called stationary, even though they are progressing. Whereas when you come to this world, then and only then are they called movers, because they have the ability through the commandments of God to go completely beyond their previous level. And that's how we connect it to the world, to the verse, the halachta bidrachav, that you are to go in God's ways. With the key, the underlying word is to go, the same word as you were quoting from the verse. So it's in Zechariah 3:7.
Thank you very much.
And it's actually explained in a number of places, but you can find it. I don't know if this is translated into English. I'm not sure. Likutei Sichos, talks of the Rabbi Melech HaMashiach, volume 4, page 1130 and on, and that is in Yiddish. But the early volumes are translated into English. I'm not sure that they got up to volume 4. I know 1 and 2 are. Give me a second here. Let's see. I don't think That's that one part in 5. Uh, yeah. No, I don't think he ever got it. The one who translated it was Rabbi Jacob Emmanuel Shochat, who already passed away. And I don't know if anyone took over and continued. Could be Brashur. No, sorry. Anyone else? Maybe Rabbi Talger is translating it. I don't know if he did it yet. Rabbi Talger. Anyone else?
So,
Yes.
so we're saying for Maimonides that if it's something that is rational or obvious, we should take the understanding that we agree that it's repugnant
Yes.
to do something.
Right.
But if it's something that would be a hoax, something that's not necessarily so obvious, then we might say we're willing to.
Then we should say, yeah.
Correct. And how do we define what is obvious versus what is not obvious? Because I know that if you ask people that are in jail, they'll often have perfectly rational reasons why everything that they did was fine. People typically rationalize their behavior.
Well, that's sort of what he was speaking about over here with all these philosophers, that it depends what the starting point is.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, you're supposed to be in tune, and your rational mind should be in tune with the divine. In other words, one of the most advanced and intellectual countries was Germany. And we see what that led to, even though they were big into university and into studying and into intellect and academia. But the problem was, it was void of God. Mm-hmm. So that's why he's saying that it's not that you have a world and then you have the laws, but the natural world has to already start with the point of the rational God. And therefore, since it is rational to keep these laws, so that's, because you're right. Otherwise, well, who's to say that, you could almost argue anything, absurd things. Someone intelligent can come along and make a whole presentation and explain why that makes sense, why killing makes sense or stealing makes sense. So what do you mean? You're destroying the whole society if everybody does that, because if you do that, so can the next person and the next. And then it's, whatever the expression is, dog eat dog, man eat man. It's a jungle. So the best man wins, the strongest one wins. And if someone, but that's why we have to take it from the divine rational. And ultimately, every normal, healthy person doesn't have to have the exact same opinion, but there's the same framework and the same laws that would make sense to us. nobody should say that under normal circumstances. We're not talking about extreme cases of self-protection and all these things, but just in the normal circumstances, not stealing and not killing, those are things that every normal, healthy person should agree with.
So in the area of the Noahide laws, that would be the case, and these other laws that might have, the things that are beyond rationality,
right,
that affect that are within the Jewish law, that option would not apply to a Noahide.
Right, that's what he's saying. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So there's really no Noahide laws that are super rational.
Okay, I've got a question then. So,
yes,
in the case of, there's these scenarios that take place everywhere in the world. Someone is in danger of starving to death, or they're in inclement weather and they have to break into a particular place to remain warm. And once they go in, they begin to consume things in order to sustain their health and stuff like that. Are those circumstances you're saying that are exceptions to this?
could be. Those are details. Could be. But for example, polygamy, for one man to have more than one wife at the same time. Torah permits that. But in the Western society that we live in nowadays, that is considered not only illegal, but it's immoral, it's very wrong, and it's a form, not by Torah law, not for the 7 Noahide commandments, but generally by the secular law, it's a form of, I don't know if the right word would be adultery, but it's immoral relationships. Not right for a man to have more than one wife. So that's one of the things that our logic has become in a certain way because of the society and what people think. And there's something to that because about 1,000 years ago, it became rabbinically forbidden for Jews to have more than one wife, at least for the Ashkenazic world. So there's something to it, but it's not like, oh, of course, that's like killing and stealing and adultery. That like never made sense and it should have never been, and it was always wrong. No, that's not so. Till this day, for the Noahide, it's permitted if done properly and if all the conditions are met. That he basically has to be able to provide. Now, is it a good idea? That's a different story. Especially if you're living in a place where it's unacceptable, so then on a number of levels, it's probably a bad idea. But it's not like it is intrinsically a disgusting, corrupt thing. No. So, but we are affected by our surrounding. But then you have to go into the details. So, is it permitted? If for survival, you mentioned the question. So, if a person, the only way for the person to live is if they kill someone else. What do you say? What do you do? Okay, so that's a very serious question. And if it's a practical thing, you really need to know the whole deal. And if someone's life depends on taking away someone else's life, what do we say? So in general, we say that why do you think that your blood is any redder than his? The expression of the Talmud. In other words, no, you cannot survive at the expense of someone else's life. However, in the classical Talmudic case, when there are two people and I have enough to save only one of us, like there's a certain amount of water that if one person drinks, he will survive. If you split it, neither will survive. And one of us has that water and the other doesn't. So who comes first? You give it to the other person and give up your life to save his life? We say no. If it's your water, we're not saying you can steal his water for survival, because he has the water and he also needs to survive. So no, you have no right to steal the water, even though that means you'll die. But if you have the water, if it's your water, you don't give it to the other guy to save his life, and then you'll die. So it's a lot of ethics that we're talking about over here. But it all falls into the 7 Noahide commandments, and all of that, each detail is rational, even though at times we wouldn't see it that way. Like the example I gave with polygamy.
Well, I'm going to take the polygamy thing then and go back to it. Wouldn't it be irrational that a Jew, his laws do not change simply because of geography? Now, he's going to be a Jew whether he's in Timbuktu or whether he's in China or whether he's in America. A Noahide, on the same token, should be a Noahide no matter where he's at. So if it's allowed that he can have multiple wives, he should be able to practice that no matter where he is, even if he disagrees with it.
Again, well, first of all, we know that the one positive commandment of the 7 is to establish court systems. And then we get into the whole discussion. What does that mean exactly? Is it just to uphold and to see to it to punish people that transgress the 6? Or does it mean that they have to make a whole bunch of laws which are not related to the 6, such as taxes, traffic, all sorts of laws to make it a normal society? So if you say it that way, so long as they're not outright contradicting the 7, which means they don't legalize murder or adultery or idolatry or theft, that they can't do. But they can say that even though by the 7 Noahide commandments, one is permitted, let's say, to have more than one wife, but we're saying not. That may be within the realm. But even if not, even if the law of the land, the lawmakers don't have that authority, but still there is the idea of whether it's a good idea. But technically, you have a point, could be it's not forbidden.
Right. And well, my thing is that when we talk about the requirements, maintaining separate homes for each wife, giving them equal time, and the rules that are applied there. If a man is capable of doing that, I don't see any reason why he shouldn't be allowed to do it. I mean, the Mormons and other groups are allowed to do it. So there's a bit of selective enforcement going on.
Okay. All right. So first of all, I don't know how the legalities work, but let me ask you this. Why is it that I think it's fair to say most countries, let's speak about the Western world. Why is it that it is illegal? What's the problem? When did it become illegal? These things progress, things evolve. It used to be that women had no right to vote. Remember that? You old enough to remember that?
Yes.
It was about 150 years ago. Women had no right to vote. And it made perfect sense. And I'm assuming your average woman did not walk around feeling, it was before the whole feminist movement. Women had no right to vote, and they understood everyone has their deal, But then the world changed, and then you could say it went too far and it got topsy-turvy. But why do these things change? How do they change? How do they evolve from being permitted to forbidden, or vice versa? What happens? What's the problem?
In the Jewish world, from my understanding, is the rabbis said that this was something that was just too difficult and people shouldn't do it because it creates too many problems. But they didn't specifically give, that this is going to happen or that's going to happen, wherever I've read it at.
But what about in the United States, the secular law? Why is polygamy not practiced?
Well, that depends on where you live. If you're in Utah, practice.
Let's say you live in one of the states such as New York, Illinois, or California. A couple, we have big cities. Just pick some big cities: Chicago, New York, Los Angeles.
I don't think there's any allowance whatsoever, except for there are people who do it untraditionally. They will do it without consulting with the courts, and they'll have multiple relations.
But why is it illegal for a man to have more than one wife?
The bigotry laws, I'm not sure.
So there must be something that society doesn't, accept it.
From what I understood, it was the church that promoted that said, monogamy, one wife. And I think from what I understood, maybe I'm wrong, but from what I understood, the Jewish community in Europe did not want to get in trouble. That was a factor.
I don't know.
Maybe it was, I'm not sure, but that's what I was thought. The question would not be whether or not we would be allowed to do that, but the question is, if the law says, then what does a Noahide? What would a Noahide do? If the law says you have to stop at the stop sign, are we required to follow the law?
That's different.
In that country, yes, in that country, but we can move across the street and the same law doesn't apply.
No, because the stop sign is completely, so to say, arbitrary or completely made up, and it doesn't infringe on any of the seven. Whereas one of the seven Noahide laws is adultery, and it's defined what is and what isn't. Mm-hmm. So once they come in and they add who gave the court system a right to start adding and fine-tuning the one of the seven. That's what I'm saying. In other words, it's like saying that you can't eat a limb off of a live animal. Let's say they take it further and say, you know what, you can't eat any livestock, vegetarian or vegan. Who gave them the right to take away eating meat? Well, it's just an extension of.
They do have extra laws regarding food. There's lots of laws. The USDA makes a lot of laws.
So as a Noahide, are those binding? Do you have to follow them?
Do we as Noahides have to obey the law of the land?
So again, obey the law of the land as long as it does not infringe on the six. Right. That's one thing. But if it's involving any of the six.
But we're not being required to break a Noahide law because we're not being permitted to marry extra people. That's not causing us to violate a Noahide law.
Well, one can argue and say that part of the Noahides is to make this world inhabitant and bring people. Well, there's more of a chance. The more wives one has, the more children they can bring.
And that's allowable. And for I'll say this: an unethical institution created a law banning something that a Noahide can actually do in other countries. And the unethical institution was a church who their religion is already on a false premise. Now we have to follow laws from a religion that's created on false premise.
Right.
When if we simply just catch a plane and go to Africa tomorrow, we can marry as many wives as we want.
Yeah, but then you can't bring them back with you. Can one then bring them legally back to and have them considered his wives?
He
To
can
be
move
legal.
right back, he can move right back into the United States and say that he's practicing the law of the land that he was married in.
All right, I don't know. I don't know the law, so I can't agree or disagree.
But when you're talking about what's expedient and what's not, and where the distinctions lie, sometimes this can get pretty complicated in a lot of different ways.
Right, that's right.
And for us to follow the law of the land, I mean, if they came out tomorrow and said we all got to bow down to a statue, I'm not going to do it.
Right.
Right, but that would be the law requiring us to violate a Noahide law. Then it would be an issue. But if we're not being required to violate.
Well, how about if they say that as an extension of thou shalt not kill, you're not allowed to kill any animals because you have this organization, PETA, or whatever they call themselves, PETA, whatever, right? And they say no killing of animals. And they put it under the prohibition of murder. They say you're murdering a creature of God. So say, wait a second, you're talking religion?
Like the Hindus do, in their country. Don't kill any.
Today, we do not define our legal system and say that this is a divine. They just make the laws out of rationality, whatever rationality they have.
So if they decide
that would be a very different scenario. We don't have that within our Western society, where the legislature does not say this is a divine commandment.
Fine. And what happens if they don't say it's a divine commandment? But they made a law that you can't kill animals, then you just have to obey.
Then I would think that we're we would have to follow it as long as we're not being told to violate any of the commandments.
Even though they are extending these 7 commandments.
Well, one of the Noahide commandments is to eat meat, so that would go against the Noahide commandment.
Well, Noahide is not commanded that he must eat meat, right? Commanded that he can't eat a limb off of a live animal.
Right.
But he doesn't have to eat a dead animal.
Okay.
Be a vegetarian.
Right, but I'm thinking that he was given this ability to eat meat at a certain point and told he could do that. So that's from heaven.
Right. But so the question is, does the government have a right to curtail or to forbid things that are not, they're not going against the Noahide, the 7 commandments, in as much as they're not telling you you must eat a limb off of a live animal. They're not telling you you must murder or you must steal, etc. They're just making more laws or extending these laws without meaning to.
Well, this is what the government does all the time. Government makes these laws all the time. They make lots of these laws.
Yeah, but as long as it is not infringing on these 7, question is this infringing on the 7? In other words, when they make laws, whatever, things that are totally unrelated to these 7, fine. I live in this country, so I have to abide by their laws. Mm-hmm. But if they're telling me how to keep the 7, even if they don't mean it in a religious, divine way.
Well, if we say that the Noahide laws are rational, mm-hmm. So they're following
but they're
reason.
divine. But they're divine.
Oh, that's where it becomes a tricky question. Is it rational or is it divine? And how do we understand that?
It's both. But
I'm with Bob on that question.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say all we have to do is just observe the Jews and how they respond when the states try to make laws that limit them and restrict them. And you'll notice they'll give a lot of pushback. So why should we not be able to give pushback as well? When those laws...
Give an example. In other words, if they say that when it comes to circumcision, we have to change a little bit, not one iota, because they're telling us how to perform. We're not doing it for health reasons. The circumcision is because God said so, and this is our tradition. It has to be done exactly this way, and no one can tell us at all how to change it. But give an example of what you're saying that there's pushback.
Well, there is pushback in like Europe and Canada where Jewish law is being challenged.
If Jewish law is challenged, of course. Yeah. In the United States also.
Yeah.
They were challenging about how to do circumcision. Then there's certain countries where they don't allow slaughtering. So you could say, okay, so don't slaughter, don't eat meat. If a Noachite would have to follow that, why can't the Jews? It's not like we have based on Mikdash, the temple, and we're told don't slaughter.
Except the Jews have positive commandments. So it's the law could infringe on your positive commandments.
What about the case of slaughtering meat? The positive commandments.
Yeah, what about the 248 negative commandments they have?
I don't know.
Well, no, but I mean, all the ones we're talking about are positive commandments that the Jews have.
Yeah.
The Noahites don't have these kind of commandments.
Right.
So we're not being told, unless we're being told we have to eat a limb of the living animal. That would be an issue. If we're being told you have to have limb, you have to allow stealing. Those kind of laws, something to that effect would be problematic.
I'm thinking of Hindus where if you were in an Indian city and you wanted a hamburger and you said, I'm going to slaughter this animal, I own it, it's my animal, and I'm going to make hamburger. Over there, they can put you in prison for it. So this is what I'm talking about. You, as a Noahide, you can eat meat. You can eat the type of meat you want. It's permissible for a government to tell you not to do it. That's another thing. Do you have to abide by that as a Noahide, or do you abide by it as a citizen because you want to do the right thing for the government?
So the question is, to what extent do Noahides have to abide by the law of the land?
Right. To what extent does the government have a right to make laws? And the Noachide, when is he obligated to abide by those laws?
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, but more so just on a logical aspect. If you're talking about the mean, the average, if the people of the world are establishing the mean, how can you induce a moral superiority of the Sheva mitzvahs if the mean, if by definition of what this writer is saying, if the mean is defining what the Sheva mitzvah should be? It's a catch-22 from a logical. In other words, this seems to be talking about almost a rational, not a super rational. A super rational perspective would be to axiomatically accept the 7, irregardless of what the world and what the average is doing, because then you would have the times of Noach, basically, where the average then was wickedness. So what's going on here when he's talking about the mean? In a few chapters previous, he was talking about accepting things axiomatically, not that they are rational so much, but that you are accepting them even if they seem irrational, because then you're not going to be able to change yourself. You're not going to be able to change the world or other people, because then the status quo is literally defining what morality is. And we live in a world which I don't like the status quo. I want to induce a revelation of godliness into the world. And if I was just doing the mean, then that would be a problem.
Well, that was the journey that we went through in this chapter. At the end, the idea is that Maimonides' idea is that the end seemed to be that we view God's law as a standard, and that we see that as rational. We define that as rational.
So we accept
from the other Aristotle and
right. So that is the average, not the way the world actually is, but the way the world is supposed to be, which is these divine laws.
So okay. Just to back up, we accept the Torah, or we're accepting these super rational laws first. And then through rational, maybe deduction, you might say, through rationality, then they can be kind of like applied. And maybe.
Well, we recognize the rationality within the seven laws.
Can you just accept them without the rationality?
Well, yeah, but that's not the ideal, because then it would be sort of, there's a world and then there's a conflict, but I am going to obey God's will instead of what the world is doing or what I naturally would like to do. That's not the ideal. The ideal is, oh, these laws are the way the world was created from the beginning. It's not like there shouldn't be a conflict here.
I got another example of this. If a Noahide elects to do a sacrifice, and he has the proper instruction and supervision of a rabbi, and he's doing this. Now, many people in many states would make laws trying to prohibit that, even though it's something that we are allowed to do if we do it in a proper manner. So if the city is telling me, oh, you can't take an animal out into the wood and slit its throat, then there's a problem. And I'm saying I'm allowed to by my religion, then that state is infringing upon my faith.
Again, the way the question would be, are you allowed to, or are you required? Are you obligated to, or are you allowed to?
You're allowed to.
Okay, so maybe they have the power, the authority to say, we don't let you. They're not going against the 7 Noahide commandments.
That was funny.
You could, if you wish to. You don't have to, you could. And they're saying, we're not letting you. If there's a law against, and nothing to do with religion, some law against painting your house a certain color. What do you mean? My religion doesn't say anything about it. I'm allowed to. Do I have to abide the law? It's not a safety issue. It's for the most ridiculous, foolish reason. But it passed, in Congress, and they said you cannot paint your house this and this color. Say, well, that's ridiculous. I'm not listening to them. Why not? They're giving me a prohibition that doesn't exist. I, as a Jew, have so many prohibitions, so many things that are forbidden from the Torah, and then rabbinically, and then customarily. And now, after the government silly thing about not to paint my house?
Yeah, Rabbi, you have 248 negative commandments and 365 positive. We've got the other way. Okay, and we've got 6 positive and 1 negative. So I mean,
yeah. Right.
So I mean, I'm sure that you guys run up against this a lot in a lot of different ways. Thus, you got all the people that are sitting there trying to figure out how do we keep ourselves being able to do what we want to do in whatever country we live in.
But yet, if they require that I must do certain things, they say I can't drive a car unless I have a license. What do you mean? I'll be responsible. I'll learn how to drive, and I'll be careful. What do I need to take a test and get this little? What am I there for? There's no such law in the Jewish code of law that I have to have a driver license in order to drive. So are they going against the Torah?
Wouldn't it be going against the law of Dinam for the Sheva mitzvahs?
Yeah, but then the question is, when it comes to the law of the land, Dina de Malchusa Dina, for a Jew, that is, so according to many authorities, it's only in monetary laws, not beyond. And as far as dinim, we're back to the same question. Is the 7th Noahide commandment of laws, of courts of law, dinim, is that simply to uphold the 6? Or does that mean that they can make all the laws that they want for the betterment and the society at large, as long as it doesn't go against these 6?
Or they think is the betterment, which may not be. So, I mean, if someone...
The government and we, and the Noachites rather, have a commandment to follow the law of the land, so then you would be required as a religious Noachite to follow what they think and you disagree with.
Say that last part again. Follow what they think and I disagree with.
You disagree. Your logic says, no, this is not for the betterment of society. They're making a mistake. But the government disagrees with you, and they made a certain law. You'd have to follow that because of the 7 Noach commandments, because of number 7, of having a court system.
I got a question.
You mean like abortion?
No, because you're giving an example of something which clearly goes against one of the 6. I'm saying something which has nothing to do with the 6.
Okay.
Like painting your house a certain color. Or they decided, nothing to do with religion. They decided that unless the weather is below 50 degrees, you're not allowed to wear a winter coat. They said, what are you talking about? I like wearing a winter coat in the 90s. And they say, no, you can't. Because that's going to give off the impression that we're not normal, or that it's going to scare people because of global warming, whatever. They came up with the whole thing, and they said that unless it's lower than 50 degrees outside, you can't wear a winter coat. If they made that law, we'd have to follow the law, because it's not a religious thing, and it doesn't go against the 6. It just, in our opinion, is ridiculous and stupid, but they're the government. So law number 7 is you have to follow the laws of the land.
So something like the American Revolution would be a no-go. In other words, you had the colonies. You had the 13 colonies under England, and
but once it's a done deal, so now even though the basis may be wrong, but now you have to deal with what you have.
Yeah. And what's the difference now between a Yisrael and non-Jews? Like, for instance, and I know we're getting maybe into some theoreticals here, but the Yisrael gets put into exile. Now they're under a different kingdom. Can they rebel and want to come back? And also, what happens in a similar situation of non-Jews? Not saying non-Jews want to come back to the land, but in other words, does Yisrael follow the Malchus, the kingdom of the non-Jewish kingdom that they're under, or do they have a mitzvah, or are they under a different authority? I would assume so, but let's just say. And then how does that relate to non-Jews? For instance, like the Revolutionary War, where they were under a king of England. Well, my ancestors were, I guess, under a king of England, and then they rebelled, things like that. What are your thoughts or insights?
Okay, so for the Jew, the concept of exile, of golus, so there's, as we mentioned, dina de malchusa dina, that the law of the land is law. However, once they begin to oppress the people, doesn't matter from my perspective if it would be anti-Semitism, but if it was any other minority or any other race or anything, if it's, and if they decide that it's they make laws against the blacks, right? Like again, this country, not that long ago, there were laws. The blacks had no rights to vote. Okay, so arguably you could say, well, what do you mean? They're second-class citizens.
How about they were slaves and they were not citizens, not even considered citizens?
Right.
That's an interesting point.
The whole thing of slavery, and the Torah does speak about slavery. And biblically speaking, in the times of the Jubilee of the Yovel, a Jew can own a slave. And there's 2 types of slaves that a Jew can own. One is a fellow Jew, an Evet Ivri. One is an Evet Kanani, a non-Jew. What does that mean to own a slave? And so on. So in the diaspora, in exile, when a Jew is in a different country, so first of all, we know it's important that the Jew knows that he's not at home. Every Jew belongs permanently and always in the land of Israel. But traditionally, as we say, because of our sins, God has exiled the Jewish people from Israel. Yeah, this time it was this king and this anti-Semitic king, but it's all, they're just doing the work, so to say, the dirty work for Hashem, to exile the Jewish people. But we have to understand that when a Jew is not living in the land of Israel, he is not at home. And therefore, there's like it gets very delicate. On the one hand, if the country is good to you, so you have to show gratitude, or as it says in Pirkei Avos, in the Ethics of the Fathers, that you should always pray for the peace of the government that you're in. And you should support the government, because if, let's say, there's a war, so the government is protecting its citizens, and the Jewish community within that country are being protected. So therefore, you do pay taxes and you do pray for the government, etc. However, if the government is clearly anti-Semitic and they're either overtly or covertly, whatever which way it is, if they are not allowing the practice of Judaism, like it was in communist Russia, to speak about recent history, so yes, so then the Jewish people have to do whatever they can to go against that and make a whole underground system and fight it and help self-sacrifice.
That's what I meant by pushback.
Yeah.
That's what I meant by pushback.
Don't give up your guns, Aaron.
Yeah, but that's when it's clearly against Judaism. They're not allowing, they made decrees clearly. They weren't allowing Jewish schools, they weren't allowing the fulfillment of all sorts of Jewish customs.
However, if we're building the Noahide communities where we have our own customs, which are pretty much, following our 7 laws, and we decide that we want to intermingle with each other and communicate with each other, and they start to get aggressive towards us, I mean, we have a right to do the same thing, I believe, right?
Well, we've discussed, is the Noahide obligated in giving up his life in order not to transgress? Concept of Kiddush Hashem. If they want to they're forcing a Noahide to do an act of idolatry, to worship some other god. So for a Jew, the law is very clear. Even if the Jew doesn't believe in it, and they're not doing it with any intentions, they're just doing the act because they're being forced to by gunpoint, they're not allowed to, and they have to give up their life. What about a Noahide? So we say a Noahide does not need to give up their life. So there is a very clear distinction. There's a big difference.
The idea of establishing, say, an office in the UN, which is Rabbi Cowen, what he's doing here. This is to address, I was thinking, whatever issues any Noahide in any country, anywhere in the world would have. If they needed an advocate or a voice, they could come through this medium, and collectively, us all over the world would be able to help our own. And I think that's the purpose of that. Maybe I'm wrong.
For whatever it's worth. I mean, for better or for worse, the UN is, spiritually, it must be some very, very good thing, very powerful. But what about when the UN is off base? What about when the world is, what happens if the UN gives a resolution which goes against the 7? So then we say they're totally off and ignore them. No question about it. What happens if, as you say, they get aggressive and it's not so easy to ignore them?
I mean, Israel just experienced that, I believe, right?
Right. So for the Jews,
what did you do in response? I mean, shouldn't the Noahide use that as an example himself of if my teachers show me the way, I follow that path if it's a good path?
For the Jews, there's no question. If the UN tells the Jewish people that this is what you need to do, and since that does go against the Torah, and since it's not for the best interest of the Jewish people, even though they may have good intentions. That's a separate argument. That's irrelevant, actually, what their intentions are, whether they're anti-Semitic or whether they're actually, they think they're helping the Jewish people. It's irrelevant. The Jewish people are to completely ignore the instructions and the sanctions and the rulings of the UN or the US for that matter. And they could just tell them, fly a kite. We're not listening. Have a good day.
And since we're building coexisting, or how do you say when something is riding in the same vein that another thing is, and right beside it? We are actually riding right beside you guys, and
Okay, but
in so doing,
difference between
I'm sorry.
level, you know, if it's a matter of your survival, that's one thing. But if it's a matter of convenience or whatever, it's not so simple. It's not very clear cut. Because the Noachite doesn't have the same rules as the Israel.
But he still walks in partnership with him, and he walks in a similar channel. So when we start developing institutions and communities and things like that, we become separate too. And they will notice us. I'm certain of that.
Okay, but it's supposed to be from within the world. All of that, the whole idea, as we're learning now, that the 7 Noachide commandments are supposed to be from within. It's God-given from above, but this is the only way that the world is supposed to. But it's not supposed to be a conflict between the world and between God. And then we have to, and then the Noahide world has to choose a side. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And unfortunately, what it may look like right now is a Noahide right now, meaning when I say Noahide, I mean a non-Jew, a human being has a choice. Do I follow the world, which is going in a certain direction, or do I follow God, which wants me and the world to go in a certain direction? So I have to make a choice. I'm a Noachide. Do I follow 7 laws of Noah, or do I do what the world says? So then, of course, you follow God. But that whole scenario is messed up. It's not supposed to be like that. That's the choices.
Thank you, Rabbi.
To be continued. All right, everybody. Be well.
Are we looking at next week?
We are. Mirz Hashem.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well, everybody.
Good, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good night.
You too. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.